whatever medium you happen to be watching on, Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, wherever you happen to be, just go ahead and send your questions in. And we are, at this point, going to look at one or two things maybe that we've been talking about this week. There were some people who had sent some questions in that are more involved, and we're going to look at those next week, hopefully. But this evening, we're going to start off with somebody asked a question, and it's a pretty good question. They asked a question about how come sometimes you see things that seem like they're out of order in the Old Testament. And what I mean when I say out of order is the example that they used is in 1 Samuel when there is no temple yet. So the temple, Solomon is going to build the temple, and Solomon doesn't really come along as a key player in things until much later in the narrative. He's definitely not in 1 Samuel 1. But in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 9, it says, after they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose, and Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. And she is deeply distressed and praying. And this is when Hannah is asking for the Lord to send her a child. And she says, if you send me a child, I'll dedicate him to the Lord. And he does send her Samuel, for whom the 1st and 2nd Samuel are named. Unless you are using the Hebrew Bible, in which case they compress 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. I think it's one big book. Maybe it's just Kings and Chronicles that they do that. I'll have to check. But so the temple, right? It says temple in the text. And if you look that word up, it's the same word that's used for temple 70 other times. It shows up that word is used 70 times to refer to the temple. But there's not a temple yet. So why does it say in 1 Samuel 1 and verse 9 that the temple of the Lord, Eli was sitting at the temple of the Lord? Why does it say that? It seems to be out of order. We would call it an anachronism. And you have something that's out of place in the timeline. There isn't a temple, but they're talking about a temple. It'd be like if you watch a movie about ancient Egypt, and there's an airplane, flying in the background of a shot. That's an anachronism. And so that's what this seems to be. What do we do with that? Does it mean that is this a contradiction? Does it mean that the biblical text is wrong? What do we see going on here? Just off the top of your head, what do you think about that?
I don't know.
That's an okay answer.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's an okay answer. I don't know. Most great discoveries start off with, I don't know. There are a couple ways you could explain it. One way is that there could have been a temple-ish complex in Shiloh. So the tabernacle goes to Shiloh and it stays there for a long time. And when archaeologists have dug it up and kind of excavated the areas there, there is a temple-like complex. Like later when Solomon actually builds a temple and all the structures that are associated with it. Mm-hmm. Have you ever asked, well, where did Solomon get the idea to build a complex the way that he built it? Why did did God tell him exactly how to build it? I don't know. Did he, where all the surrounding structures went, or was he just replicating something in a bigger and better way that was already in existence? Well, it seems like to some people, I'm not aware of there being any biblical evidence other than perhaps this in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Or other places where the word temple shows up out of order. It's going to show up a couple times in the 1 Samuel. They think that maybe there was a structure there that was similar to a temple. And the way that I've seen it described is that they had walls, and then they would, instead of the tent poles that were given for the tabernacle, they had walls in place, and they covered those walls with the tent coverings. And so they had a weird temple-y tent, and it would be referred to just as the temple. And so that's a possibility, that because the tabernacle had been in place for so long, they kind of started building things up around it. Because originally the tabernacle was meant to travel. They're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and then it comes into the land. I mean, it's mobile. But then once it comes to Shiloh, it's kind of put in place for a while, and they think things may be built up around it. So they call that the temple. It wasn't much of a temple, comparatively speaking, but enough that maybe you could see, okay, well, maybe that's what's being talked about. Another answer that people offer is that you have these books that are put together by what would be called a redactor. And sometimes we see documents, and when we hear the word redact, we think like cutting stuff out of a document, like classified documents. Sometimes they'll release pieces of it to the public, and they'll say it's been redacted. And so that's kind of the context that we hear that. But a redactor is just somebody who edits and fits things together in an appropriate way. And the document is redacted, a classified document is redacted in that it's made proper for the public to view it. Because when you make something public, everybody knows it now, even your enemies. And so there is some redaction going on there seems to be in these Old Testament books. For example, Deuteronomy, which is written by Moses. Deuteronomy contains details about Moses' death. How did he write those? Somebody wrote them, but it probably wasn't him, unless he wrote down this stuff and then he went off and then he prophesied his death. There are things like where Deuteronomy says that Moses was the humblest man who ever lived. Did he write that? So there's some evidence of what we would call a redactor, and the word editor makes people nervous for some reason, but it's very similar, where you have this information that God has given his people and somebody is putting it together. And it could be one of the instances where in the manuscripts that we have, maybe a long time ago, one of the redactors just stuck the word temple in because it was in a fixed location, it was the place that they went, and in order for the story to make sense to the people who were hearing it at the time, the word temple fits better. And we do the same thing with that before people get upset. We translate, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, and it's being translated into English, we translate it in a way that makes sense to people today. And so there will be idioms that maybe a translator will kind of tweak so that it makes sense to a modern English reader. And so that there actually was a temple complex, something like a temple complex in Shiloh. But it doesn't mean when you come across things like this, it doesn't mean that the Bible made a mistake. Right? There are other explanations. Because if this was a big mistake, somebody would have noticed. Right? So somebody would have come along and said, wait, this isn't right. And it would have been a bigger discussion until it wouldn't have waited to become a discussion until you get to the 19th and 20th centuries. And really that's where things like this became a big deal, where all of a sudden people were making a big deal about this seeming anachronism or this word that seems to be out of place historically. But if it really was such a shocking thing, right. I think that it would be talked about before then. And maybe it was, and I'm just not aware of it. But these are things that you'll see from time to time in the text. And normally there's an explanation for why it happens. Because the Bible, when you think about it, is written in human language. And the purpose of human language is to do what?
To communicate.
To
communicate to people.
Yeah, to people, right? That's the point. And so when God's will is then put into human language, it has to still do its job. It still has to communicate. I mean, if we're going to be absolute purists about it, then let's just not have English, right? Only Greek for the New Testament, and really only Greek for the Old Testament, because the Septuagint is like the best out of all the anyway, I'm kind of partial to the Septuagint. Only the original languages. Right? But we don't do that. We're okay with them translating it into English because we understand that human language, the purpose of human language is to communicate to humans. There are ideas and the language is really just a vehicle for an idea. And as long as the idea is getting moved along, then the language is doing its job. I had a teacher one time in high school explained that words are like boxcars for a train. And the boxcar itself has nothing in it. It is a person who takes an idea and puts it in the boxcar and then wants that payload or that cargo to travel to another person who can then unload it And the way that you move the idea from one brain to another is language. And so there is a divine idea, right? We would use maybe the word wisdom. That's how the Bible kind of talks about it. There is divine wisdom that God wants humans to know, and he has chosen to use human language to convey that. So he's doing the same thing. He's taking these boxcars, he's putting his ideas into the boxcar, and he's moving those things over to people. Well, it's in Hebrew in the Old Testament. I don't speak Hebrew. So I need somebody to take that idea out of the Hebrew box, out of the Hebrew, car, and put it into an English one, and then push it to me. And so you're moving around the idea. You're going from language to language. It's not necessarily the precise words that are important, but the idea that is getting put in the box. And so that's something to consider when you're translating from one language to another. And we run into that all the time when I'm trying to put stuff into Spanish, right? Because I do a horrible job of this, right? She is fluent in Spanish and I am not. And so I'm all the time trying to make Spanish do what English does. And Spanish doesn't work the way English does. It has a different logic behind it. And so I'll all the time ask her, how do you say this in Spanish? And she looks at me and she goes, you don't say that in Spanish. You would say it like this. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, right, because it's a different car. It's the same idea, but you have to put it in the train car that works for the language that you're speaking. And idioms are really difficult to translate over, like a cat on a hot tin roof. Do they have that in Spanish?
No, I don't think so.
So
I don't know all the idioms, so I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not as fluent as you give me credit, but I'm fluent enough.
Fluent enough. That's right. So you'll see stuff like that. Anytime you're dealing with a human language, you're going to see stuff like that, where it's the idea that really matters. It's the idea of what the author is trying to get across. And so regardless of whether or not that's how that ultimately is explained, is it a redactor coming by and making this make sense for people who have only been alive since the temple, or is there a temple-like structure in place in Shiloh? I think both of those are decent answers for why you would have a temple talked about before there is a temple. Another idea is that it just means palace. Because the word is also translated 10 times as palace, which would just mean like a dwelling place for a king or somebody really important. And so it could be something more along the lines of the house of the Lord instead of the actual temple structure like we think of when we hear the word temple. It could just mean the Lord's palace. And so that's another explanation. And that's why when you come across these word questions, they're really some of the most complicated questions, because when you're dealing with language, when you ask a question about this language in 1 Samuel chapter 1, you're really asking a question about ancient Hebrew. And you're asking a question, if you're basing it off of the Septuagint, you're asking a question about a Greek translation that was made in around 250 BC. So your question about the language spans at least 2,200 years. I mean, it's a big jump because you're dealing with culture, you're dealing with the way words are used, and so the word questions are difficult.
I don't know, it's just loosely related, but this makes me think about where I guess Paul says not to argue about words. Like, oh yeah, we definitely shouldn't argue about words, because especially when it's a translation, it's not the original language, and so it can be translated different ways, and so we shouldn't be like a little vehement. No, this is the word, and I mean, I just, if it's something small, small, to just remember that it's a translation and we don't have to be quite so dogmatic about exact translations, but rather the idea being
it's the idea,
right?
Yes, it's the idea that matters. And you're right. The passage that you mentioned is in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And it's interesting that it's talking about doctrines, which are teachings. And he says, if anyone has a different teaching and doesn't agree with the healthy words or the sound words, sound means healthy, of our Lord Jesus, and doesn't teach what accords with godliness, he is puffed up and conceited and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy and quarrels about words, fightings about words.
Oh no, it's his quarrels.
Right. That's right.
You can say fighting.
Fighting.
It says quarrel.
Fisticuffs. Which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicion, constant friction among people who are depraved in mind and deprived of the truth. And so you're right. Before we start getting into big word arguments, we need to be careful, because there's a warning there that, hey, don't take these words and try and read more into them than they're just trying to convey, because they are a tool. They're a vehicle to push an idea from one brain to another brain. And if you try and do more than that, now you're going to cause trouble. And so we do have to be careful, within reason, right? I mean, you can go too far with any idea.
Definitely.
But generally speaking, it's the idea that we're after, not the specific wording, especially when you're moving in between languages. And so that's something to consider.
Hey, Tracy Chapman. She waved.
So that was like the question that I recently got that I felt like we could cover that wasn't too involved. And so did you have any, if y'all have any questions, go ahead and send them in.
Or this is going to be a short Bible study.
Yeah, it'll be short tonight.
Tracy's got one. I can sense it. Come on, Tracy.
So didn't one of the boys have a question this morning?
We've been having a lot of questions in our daily reading about David.
Oh, yeah.
And about when you read about the way he's, when you read how he's written about, and you see the things that he did.
Yeah.
And God still blesses him and is on his side. Seems like.
Yeah, it's not fair.
And how Saul is punished for doing things that would seem to be about the same level of bad.
Mm-hmm.
And he's punished, but David's not in the same way, at least. Well, David does get punished for things, but the kingdom is taken away from Saul, and David also does things that are not right. So anyways, we just had a lot of questions about that recently.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing when you read through the story of David. He does stuff that in my mind is just as bad or worse than Saul. I mean, mass murder, all this. I mean, he does some bad stuff. He's very ruthless. And so at times, and other times he's very merciful. And so it's just interesting that I always tell people, or I make mention that I'm very glad that my life is not recorded in the Bible, because you get the good and the bad. And I think that's on purpose to a large extent, because if all you read about David was all these perfect things where he did everything right and he never did anything wrong, you'd have to sit back and you'd have to go, he's not a real person.
Yeah.
Who does that? Who does everything right and never does anything wrong besides Donald Duck? I mean, who's always wrong? Who's never? How's
never
that go?
wrong, but always
who's
right.
Never wrong?
Who
but
never
always
dreamed
right?
of starting a fight? Yeah.
No one but Donald Duck. Yeah. So that's important, that when you look at the leaders, they're flawed. Even the one who is held up as the type of the Christ to come, because David is not the Messiah. And so those details, if nothing else, they kind of solidify that. David's not good. Even though the Bible is complimentary about him, it'll say he did everything that God wanted, except for that matter with Uriah the Hittite, which there's more that he did that wasn't good. But I mean, it's just giving you this general picture. He generally did what God wanted him to do, but there were some things that he did that were really wrong, and that's important, because he is not the Messiah. And so even in the people who kind of give you a picture of Jesus, they give you a broken picture, and they fall way short. And that will be every hero in the biblical story. They are all deeply flawed individuals. And that's important to remember. They are deeply flawed individuals, because they are not the deliverer. They are not the redeemer. They are not divine. They're not Jesus.
Helps you see how much greater Jesus is.
Mm-hmm.
It also gives you a little bit of comfort to know, because you can look at these great heroes of the faith and think, wow, I don't measure up to them. I am not as good as they are. But when you do recognize, oh, okay, they were flawed too. They made mistakes, but they were still faithful in the end. Then it gives me hope that there's hope for me. Though I'm not perfect, I can still be faithful and still be pleasing to God.
Yeah.
And it also shows just how merciful and forgiving he is. He is so gracious and is willing to cleanse us of everything that we're repentant of. He'll forgive it, even the terrible things that David did, causing Uriah's death and the death of many, many others, taking a woman that was not his wife and was someone else's, and other things, but those big ones stand out. God forgives him for it, and he goes on and does other good things for God.
Yeah, I was updating the caption.
Yeah, and there's okay, yeah.
And so we to kind of cap that off. Some of the things that David does will become issues in the New Testament. And maybe we can talk about that at a later time, like in Matthew chapter 12. When David is running away from Saul, he goes to the priestly dwelling place at Nob, and he asks for bread. And the priest that he's talking with says, "There's no bread here except for the show bread, the bread of the presence. It's in the presence of the Lord." And David says, "I'll take it." Actually, I think the priest offers it to him, if I remember the story right. I think the priest says, "There's nothing but this. There's nothing except for this bread, and you can have it if." And so the priest gives David this showbread, which only the priests were supposed to eat. Right? There's no exceptions in the law. It's just the priests are supposed to eat it. And then in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus will bring that up because his disciples are rubbing grain in their hands and eating that on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees charge them, they accuse them and say, they're doing what's not lawful to do. And then Jesus brings that up. Have you not read about David when he eats the showbread, which is unlawful for any but the priest to eat? So there's a lot of things like that show up in the biblical account. And the cool thing is that Jesus doesn't sweep that stuff under the rug. He pulls that out and he's like, "Look, this is ugly. Deal with it." Yeah. And so it's
well, yeah, it just gives us so much hope. God doesn't want us to lose hope. He recognizes that we're but dust. We're going to fail. We're going to sometimes fail miserably.
Yeah.
And it just glorifies him all the more. Not because, we shouldn't want to sin, but the fact that he is so gracious to forgive and that he is so powerful to wipe away our sins, that Jesus' blood takes all of that away, and how wonderful he is to have taken all that upon himself and then to give us hope and life still. That just glorifies God. And then ever after that, after having been cleansed, we should never want to do that to him again.
Yeah.
But even if we do fall again, just to know that it's always there. That's how wonderful he is. And because he's so wonderful, we don't want to take advantage of that. We never, God's not going to be mocked. He knows if we're taking advantage. Right. We're like, I'll just go say sorry later, it just should make us fall on our knees and praise him all the more for his goodness. And we do have a couple of questions, I see. Woo! And see, Tracy didn't fail me. Thank you, Tracy. She's got a question in there. Or a comment.
Yeah.
A comment. Well, that's good.
Yeah, and that's, Tracy, that's what we're talking about, where it says the Israelite, how they turn away from God and God takes them back. That is the story of the Old Testament. Right? So after you kind of get to Exodus, where God redeems the people, there's this promise of redemption that is given to Abraham, and you see the redemption in Israel. And then from that point forward, it's a story of back and forth relationship with Israel. God never moves. In fact, maybe God does move. Maybe God moves to them. And so they're on and off. It's a love-hate with Israel, loving God and hating God, and loving God and hating. It's just back and forth and back and forth. And God doesn't give up on them until they leave him for good. When they do the unthinkable, when they bring idols into the most holy place and basically say God is just one God among the gods, at that point God says, guys, it's not me, it's you. This isn't working out. I'm leaving. And he leaves. You can see him leave in the prophet Ezekiel. And so but the fact that he is that patient with them, and he doesn't leave them until they utterly reject him, then that gives us hope. That's where our faith is. God, we are with the Lord unless you utterly reject him.
Right.
And so there is a lot of assurance in that. And it is comforting. It is good to know that.
Yeah.
So we have another question about the wave offering. David Lee asking me technical questions. So the question is, what is the wave offering? And you see it in Exodus chapter 29 and Leviticus chapter 7 and in other places. It's part of some festivals. There will be a wave offering. It's not translated consistently. Sometimes you'll see wave offering, heave offering, elevation offering, a lifting up. And that's really kind of the picture. And so wave offering maybe isn't a good name. The ideas, the word that's used there seems to be like a picking it up.
I would say like waving it before the Lord is what makes me think of it.
Well, that's the idea. The wave. Well, if you think about what an ocean wave does, it doesn't. Well, I guess it depends on your perspective. Mm-hmm. If you're out on the middle of the ocean, the waves go up and down. Mm-hmm. And if you're on the beach, they go in and out. Mm-hmm. And so it depends on, your perspective. But it seems to be like a lifting up and a putting back down. And that seems to be the idea of the wave offering. And that will be done in several of the feasts, or various rituals that the Israelites will do. That there will be a wave offering. And it seems to indicate like a transfer of ownership. And so when you have the meat sacrifices that are brought before, I think that's what the passages are about. In Exodus 29, it's about a meat offering. A ram is brought and it's sacrificed, and it will be consecrated through the wave offering. And it's almost like the wave offering then gives different ownership. This was somebody else's, but now it's brought before the Lord and it's elevated. It's brought up, and now it belongs to the Lord, and the Lord uses it to do whatever he wants. And that idea of lifting up is really significant when you go in the biblical text. And so there is a sense in which Jesus himself is an elevation offering, because he actually uses the phrase himself, when I am lifted up. Talking about the crucifixion.
Wow. Yeah.
And so there's this idea in which he is there among people, and then he is lifted up, very much like the wave offering is lifted up before the Lord. There's also the day that Jesus was raised, right? They do days differently than we do. So Jesus is raised on what we would call Sunday morning before the sun rises. And then that morning, around the time of the sunrise, the priest would be in the temple, and they would do a wave offering of grain, a wave offering of the first fruits. Mm. And Jesus is lifted up. He's raised up in his resurrection. And you have the priest lifting up the first fruits. And Jesus himself is called the first fruits of the resurrection. And so there's all these different pictures where something being elevated up and given to the Lord comes into play all throughout the biblical text. Wow. And so I think that's the image. That's the importance of the wave offering, is that image of something being lifted up and given to God. Hmm. And then if you pay attention throughout the rest of the biblical text, every time you see something being lifted up, there's normally a reason why the writer would include that. Mm-hmm. And that'll be the bronze serpent is lifted up on the pole. Yeah. All these different things are raised up, and it's important. So I don't know if that's if that kind of helps give some context maybe to that offering, but that seems to be the idea: the transfer of ownership to God, and it happens through this elevation, this being lifted up.
That's a neat picture. It's amazing, all the connections.
Yeah. And so there are some churches that will have like the name elevation in the name of their church. I don't know, but I've often wondered if that's where it comes from.
Oh, I thought it was just to be like hip.
I don't know, maybe. But I've wondered. Modern. I mean, I don't know. I've never asked somebody.
Yeah, no, I'm just kidding.
And because I normally don't think of it when I'm talking to people. But now maybe I'll make a note to ask the next
that'd
time.
be really cool.
Next time somebody says, "Oh, I go to Elevation," like, why is it called that?
Yeah.
Is it the wave offering? I don't know. They might look at me like I'm crazy.
Well,
make them think.
That's right.
Make me think.
Be a good conversation starter.
That's right.
We can both learn something.
That's right. So that's all the questions that I know of. Did we cover the ones? We covered the ones that the boys had. Have allergies. So we can just go ahead, unless there's something that you thought know or have thought of that you want to talk about. I'm not trying to put you on the spot or anything.
No, not at all. All right, I'm watching the chat.
If just kind of to note, if you happen to be staying home and you have extra time and you really want to read some books, I think it is the Erdman's Publishers. I'll try and post a link. People have been, I've seen different people have been sharing links to different book publishers that have a lot of really good books on sale right now. Not all religious books are created the same. I mean, that's true with any kind of book. And so you do want to be a little careful about what you read and by who is writing it. I would recommend that anything that you read be written by somebody who is an expert in the field that they're writing about. You know, in an age of self-publishing, anybody can write anything about anything. And you want to be careful to make sure that you're getting a reputable book. So like big publishing companies like Erdman's, Crossway, Tyndale, big publishers like that tends to have authors that have been more vetted. Just so that if you do buy a book and you do start reading it, you just don't, you know, first of all, you don't waste your money and your time. And then maybe even more importantly, you're not reading something that somebody is putting out there that is wrong. So I mean, I'll put a list. I'll share a list. Try to remember to do that of some of the specials that they have on books. I was able to get one book that was on sale, and I can't remember the title right now.
Is it over here?
No, I don't know where it is, but it's actually about a really technical topic, and it would be on the iPad. Oh. It's about a really technical topic that the writer is able to take and make accessible to anybody. Now, we won't be experts on this when we're done reading it, but it's about ancient Near Eastern literature. And you read that and you're like, snooze fest. But when you think about the thing we were just talking about with the temple and that word that's used there, and why is that word used, that's the kind of stuff that this book is about. I think it has something to do with like hidden treasures from the ancient East or something like that, ancient Near East. But understanding the culture and the time in which we see Israel in the biblical account. And it's a very good book. The guy is very careful to note that the Bible seems to be different from many of the other types of literature that we see. For one, it's very accurate in everything that it talks about. And so, I mean, he does a good job of making this very complicated, sometimes kind of boring. I mean, it could be pretty boring, talking about ancient Near Eastern cultures and cuneiform tablets and all these things. I mean, it could put you to sleep, but he does a really good job. He makes it interesting. He brings the topic to life. He presents it in a way that anybody could read it. And so if you've ever wanted to know more about the history of Israel, and if you've ever wanted to know, Dan King suggested CEI Bookstore. I don't know if they have any specials or not, but they do. They have good material. And so if you check out their website, it's just CEI Bookstore. There's also, what's the other one? I think CEI is the one now that I was thinking of. Anyway, so he takes this topic that could be really uninteresting. And so if you've ever been thinking, you know, I want to know more about the history of the world when Israel is around, you know, ancient Israel, this would be a book that you can read. I think it's called Hidden Treasures. Okay. And it talks about the ancient Near East and bringing those things up. Oh, we got another question. And it's a question. Why are you guys doing this to me? Okay. Do we want to do this? Oh, we're out of time.
You can always tackle that one next week. I actually had something too. So
I think
mine might be easier.
I think that we can probably do it. Jeff Listenby asked. He said that he's heard people use the story of David and Jonathan to justify homosexuality, and that is a really involved question. But I think we can address it quickly, and maybe we can come back to it next week. We can start with that maybe. What was your question?
I was going to ask about prayer and fasting, like the role of fasting in our prayer life.
That's not a short question.
Oh, it's not either.
No,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot. But.
So let's start with Jeff's question,
okay.
or his I guess his statement. It's not really a question, but we'll talk about it like it is a question. So you have David and Jonathan, and they have a very interesting relationship. Just to kind of give you background, if you're unfamiliar with the story, King Saul is the first king in Israel. Israel comes to Samuel, who we were just talking about a little while ago, and they say, hey, we want a king. We want to be like all the other nations. And when you kind of take a step back and look at what's going on, there are some armies that are coming, and they're about to invade Israel, and the leadership in Israel is lacking. And so Israel they're tired of going into bondage and out, and in and out, and in and out, in the judge cycle, where they'll be good for 40 years, and then they're slaves for 40 years. They're good. They're tired of it. They want a king. They think maybe if we have a king, all of this will stop. And so they're looking for an answer to a problem that they're creating themselves. But anyway, that seems to be their thought process. So Saul is named the king, and one of Saul's sons is named Jonathan. Well, Saul does some things that are silly. And God basically says, you're not going to be the king anymore. I'm going to take the kingdom away from you and your family, and I'm going to give it to somebody else. And Jonathan is one of those sons who just now, even though he is a prince in Israel, he will never be the king. Because God said through his prophet, I'm taking the kingdom away, I'm going to give it to somebody else. That somebody else happens to be David. Samuel will go, and he will anoint David secretly, and then there will be a big conflict between Saul and David for quite some time. David will be king in part of Israel for 7 years, and he will be king over all of Israel for 33 years. But in the middle of all that tension, where Jonathan's father is continuously trying to kill David, he's setting traps for him, he's sending him on dangerous missions, hoping that he'll be killed. He just has it out for the guy. In the middle of all that, David and Jonathan are friends, very, very good friends. And sometimes the language that is used about the friendship between Jonathan and David causes a modern reader to say, oh, well, maybe there was something there more than friends. Maybe they had a different kind of relationship than it just